Well, now let me officially welcome you to our DILEMA lecture. Thank you so much for coming, and welcome to the Astor Institute. My name is Claudia Klonowska, and I'm a PhD researcher with the Astor Institute in international law, and it is my pleasure today to moderate the session and to welcome Dr. Rupert Barrett-Taylor to us as a speaker. This lecture is organized as part of the DILEMA project, which stands for Designing International Law and Ethics into Military AI. And in the last 5 years, we have been working in an interdisciplinary team under the leadership of Dr. Berenice Boutin to study and problematize the use of military AI systems under international law frameworks. And some of our research outputs are available at the registration desk as you enter and leave the room. As part of the project, we've been organizing the DILEMA lecture series for which we regularly invite academics and other experts working on issues related to military AI technologies to present their work and share their reflections. And it is our great honor that today's lecture is delivered by both an experienced engineer and academic in this field. Dr. Rupert Barrett-Taylor has over 20 years of experience working in defense and security issues. He holds an undergraduate degree in aerospace engineering and a war studies master's. His PhD thesis that he defended not so long ago is a socio-technical analysis problematizing and critiquing the conventional understanding of software as a principal means for identifying targets and improving organizational efficiency and optimizing the targeting process. And I believe some of these insights will also come through today's presentation. But Dr. Barrett-Taylor also has experience in operational deployment as a civilian analyst and liaison officer for the United Kingdom in Afghanistan, and worked as an open source analyst with the private sector. He also served with the UK Civil Service, where he was head of the team supporting the Cross-Government Integrated Security Fund, and currently is working with the Turing Institute. Last brief note from my side on the format. First, we'll have the lecture of about 40 minutes, and then we'll move into what I hope will be a very dynamic Q&A session. The whole event will be recorded, but only the visual from this side, so feel free to still ask your questions. And please feel free to stay with us afterwards for the drinks and the reception. So thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
This microphone thing in front of me. Hi everyone. Thanks to everybody for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm actually that was a very long introduction of my experience, and my PhD thesis forms the heart of some of the things I'm going to be talking about today. And so you have to bear with me. I'm going to do a lot of exposition before I actually get to the bit where I talk about artificial intelligence, because there's a few things that I kind of want to get off my chest first. But the sort of unofficial title for my lecture is With a Clausewitz. Are we kind of at the end of, is automation kind of rendering sort of our old sense of what war is for kind of slightly irrelevant? So that's kind of the theme of this. I'm concerned about the way in which automation, including artificial intelligence, is taking warfare. So I'm going to talk through a few things. First, I'm going to set the scene. This is why I say there's going to be a bit of exposition here, because I'm going to set the scene and talk a bit about the kind of the format of warfare as I kind of understand it, so what modern warfare really comprises of. And then we're going to talk a little bit about epistemology, because why not? It's a fun thing to talk about, and we can all talk about it for hours, and how it relates to targeting, because that's really at the heart of modern warfare. And then we're going to talk about the implications of that within technology, tactics, and strategy, and that's where we get into the conversation about automation and artificial intelligence. And just to say up front, I'm a bit wary of AI as a label. I'm sure you're all very aware that that's just a label that's on the side of a massive bucket of technologies. Okay, it's not a specific thing that does one job. AI is a kind of label that we attach to all sorts of technologies that automate various practices and processes. And I think that's the point. What we're talking about here, or what I'm going to be talking about, is how process or process-based war is being increasingly automated, and how that's leading us away from strategy or the sort of the effective management of what war is by the state. So we kind of talked about this, but the genesis of my PhD is when I was there in 2015 thinking about all these sort of problems as a civilian. But we can skip over that because Claudia introduced me very kindly. So let's talk a bit about modern warfare. Now, great. Modern warfare is built on processes themselves which are highly reliant on technology to collect data, ingest it, and process it into knowledge, which can be used to plan operations, find battlefield targets, whether they're kind of material infrastructure, objects, or whether they're human beings. The picture here, some of you might be familiar with. This is John Boyd's observe, orient, decide, and act loop, which really is, it's underpinning the basic conceptual idea of how the West understands warfare, right? So the OODA loop, which, for those of you who don't know, John Boyd was a US fighter pilot who was instrumental in 80s and 90s US defense strategy. He
Sound me up a little.
I can try. How's that?
That's better.
We better? Okay, sorry about that. John Boyd was the very instrumental strategist. Started as a fighter pilot thinking about the ways in which humans make decisions under pressure. And he created this thing. And you'll note it's really complicated. There's all sorts of things going on in there in terms of biases, how people make decisions, the kind of information they ingest, all sorts of things going on there. It's important to note the complexity of that. We're going to come back to that in a little while when we think about the processes that are used on the battlefield. So the questions we can ask about this model of warfare is, how does the selection of targets by algorithm relate to kind of widest questions of strategy and human intent? So because warfare is supposed to be for a purpose, right? It's not just supposed to go on forever. We're actually supposed to be doing something with it. So the question is, when we reduce it to process, using models like this, are we actually sufficiently using it to achieve an end, or are we just doing it to sort of perpetuate the process? But how do we get here? Like, where do we get to the point where the sort of the model of warfare that we're sort of seeking to fight? The model of warfare that we use in the West really is almost 100 years old. It's been reinvented several times for different generations, but it really originates in the pre-Second World War era. So where we're talking about, there's three pictures here, which I can just sort of quickly talk through. The top, AWPD-1, that is Air Warfare Planning Department Plan Number 1. It's the first, I think, example of a systematized view of how to try and break an enemy using air bombardment. Okay, so selected targets, in that case power plants, transportation, oil and gas, aircraft parts, which was developed by the US in order to kind of justify building a bomber fleet, but it's also enemy as system. And it's also very subjective. This is not an objective sort of cold decision. This is a bunch of people got around a table and said, how can we defeat Nazi Germany? Well, actually, we can defeat their infrastructure by air bombardment. Great. How do we do that? Well, they got power plants. Maybe we can attack those. It was all very much done subjectively. But later, that's conflated with an objective understanding of what the enemy is, right? So in the middle there, you've got a diagram which is called Assault Breaker. That's a US conceptual program for defeating the enemy at depth on the battlefield. Okay, so sensors mated to computing, mated to precision strike. The idea being that you could find the enemy at depth and destroy them before they hit the battlefield. Again, same idea, enemy as system. Someone decided we could defeat the enemy by constructing them as a system. And then at the bottom, for those of you who don't know, that's General Stanley McChrystal, who was the architect behind what was later called industrial scale targeting in Iraq during, the early 2010s? So he conceptualized this idea of human networks. He was one of the first people to really mobilize that during the global war on terror, to find insurgents as networks and strike at them. Again, same idea, different generation, but enemy as system, in this case a human system. So what I'm trying to get at is that you've got the same idea being repeated over and over again. Process-based, systematized warfare. And that model of warfare has been called a number of things inside and outside the military establishment. You could say remote warfare being something probably understood with academically, but within the establishment you've got things like effects-based operations, network-centric warfare, the comprehensive approach, what's the latest one? Multi-domain warfare, mosaic warfare. They're all the same thing, reinvented for different generations, right? So different computation, different levels of computation available, different data available. Same idea. Systematize the enemy, find their weak points, strike at them. And the premise of that model is very much based on our social cultural preferences. So it's based on industry and efficiency. So when we think about this kind of model of warfare, it's really kind of has roots in how industry thinks about itself, optimizing processes in order to make itself more efficient. Okay, so there's a socio-cultural dimension to this. It's not just we came up with an idea, it wasn't necessarily based in empirical evidence, it was based on our preferences for doing lots of other things. And so the idea is that we would find the easiest way, the most optimized way of fighting warfare in order to kind of bring it to a close more quickly, because we'd seen that the more optimized we make our industry, the more effective it is, theoretically. So one other point that's worth making is that this is a generational thing. It's always nearly in becoming. There's a desire to this as well. Like there's generations of warfighters who've sought out this model of warfare, this like minimum casualty, maximum precision form of warfare. And it's always just in becoming. It's never quite there. It's always just an experiment. And that's an interesting idea, right? So it's never quite there. It's just next generation, or maybe it will be this. Maybe it'll be this time. Maybe this time we'll get the perfect form of warfare. It never quite arrives. And interestingly, the idea survives in the face of evidence to show that it fails, right? So Iraq, Afghanistan, two very notable examples of failure of systematic warfare. And yet the idea survives, right, in the face of empirical evidence to the contrary. That's interesting. So that implies that within the institutions themselves, there's a belief in it that transcends empirical evidence. And that's one of the things I want to talk about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my research. Would it be possible to zoom out of my notes a bit, if anyone's in the thing, because I can't see all of my notes in here. Is anyone in the tech room? Just get them up.
Can you zoom out so that we can see all of the notes in here?
Sorry, I might be able to. Ooh, okay, let's find my. There we go. That's the button. There, that's it. Keep going. Keep going. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Right, great. So. So I'm just going to talk a bit about my research because that kind of feeds into what I was just talking about. The way in which I was thinking about my thesis is trying to call out this area of objectivity that supports this narrative that the warfare reliant on datafication is its apex form, right? We're in this world where like AI is the next kind of iteration of this apex form of warfare, where all we need to do is find the right things on the battlefield and destroy them, and we're there. That's it. Perfect warfare. And it's supported by this belief, as with industrial production, that efficiency is the ultimate marker of success, and that optimization itself can be the kind of a legitimate goal for those fighting warfare. We're drawn into process, we're drawn into making warfare efficient, because that's how we feel like the world should be. Belief in optimization and efficiency is to believe that the content of battle can be reduced to bits of quantified data. Okay, and systematized for processing. And inherent to that belief is that the complex constellations of human interactions and beliefs are irrelevant to the pursuit of warfare. So anything that's not quantifiable is excluded from analysis. Okay, so processes think very in quantifiable terms. And the way I thought about this was that my thesis explored how perceptions of efficiency and optimization are conferred because of the employment of data processing techniques. So we think of our form of warfare as apex and objective and great because we rhetorically use technology to cover for sociocultural and political practices, assumptions and biases that underlie the processes that we use to create targets, right? So there's all this stuff going on. It's not just an objective process where we create targets. There's all sorts of other things happening behind the scenes. Belief, subjective belief in the kind of the process, cultural preferences, they all feed in to create this mode of warfare, which we call objective, but actually, is it? or is it just belief? Is it vibes? Sorry, that's not the right word, but you know what I mean. There's not necessarily as objective as maybe we think it is. And because of my experiences in Afghanistan particularly, I wanted to explore this. Why did we get to the point where we created human networks? And why do we use some data at the expense of other data? So what I did was I built 3 case studies to explore target-focused and data-fied war up to the late period of the Global War II, which is my experiences, and was thinking about how that lineage of developing human networks for targeting is kind of rooted in air bombardment pre-war, right? It's not a new idea. It's presented as revolutionary, but it's evolutionary, and it's also very old, and it's not based on empirical evidence. And what I was interested in doing was showing how that process of reducing humans to different forms of network is indicative of a belief that warfare should be efficient in the face of evidence to highlight the contrary. You know, war fought in this way aspires to make the world conform to this digital representation of the enemy, right, that we produce through software. And it's created through this complex stack of data and processing and software. But actually it makes failure kind of inevitable when you think about it, because there's no way that any real-world human enemy, particularly a fully formed human enemy, as opposed to the algorithmic enemy that only uses a subset of data, is going to behave as we algorithmically determine. So the way in which we produce digital representations means that failure is pretty much inevitable. We are never going to win wars this way. It's impossible. And the paper that I flagged up in my abstract, they suggest that, Nordin and Oberg suggests that thanks to process, war as fighting has disappeared in favour of bureaucracy. And that's true. I think there's such a focus on delivering process that we kind of ignore the violent, brutal reality of the battlefield, and we focus in on the technical process of delivering targets. But at the same time, we're also starting to ignore strategy because we're so focused on the process and the technology. And I'll come back to that shortly. I think the targeting system or the knowledge generation processes that we have, they do more than create targets as well. Just as a sidebar, I think one of the experiences of my thesis was sort of really pointing at the fact that software itself within process, it helps to mediate organizational conflict. So if you've got divergent opinions within an organization, they tend to come together around process. People are brought together by it. It creates a kind of community and belief. So even one of the points about targeting not being an objective and linear process is that actually software helps solve lots of institutional schisms. People get stuff from the software. They can point at it and say, look, here, we believe in this. It creates community. So you've got this great sort of tool, technology, that not only creates targets, but it also helps unify your organization, helps bring everyone together. And so, you know, the model of warfare survives even in the face of empirical evidence that shows that the actual way in which we fight wars doesn't work. And that's, again, thanks to technology. I am going towards AI, by the way. I mean, I'm kind of, this is a long tail here, but there's a real need to explain what technology does within warfare, I think. And so the point is that the protection of belief and the interests around the targeting process, so the belief in the form of warfare, it means that those kind of self-interested things that are protected by the targeting process, they're as important as the strategy, or the wider interests of strategy of war, right? So these sort of institutional interests that are surrounding the targeting process, they're all solved by technology, and they help manage organizational conflict, and that is actually just as important in fighting the war itself. So there's all sorts of micropolitics within this. And that kind of calls into question this kind of objectivity and pursuit of efficiency, right? So there's a lot of it is a rhetorical cover for other things. And just to sort of say that the horrible, messy picture there, that is one of my case studies. That's a system called DCGS, which is the US Army's intelligence production system. I've put that absolutely horrible diagram out there, which is wonderfully 90s, because it illustrates the complexity of the kind of systems that we're talking about here, right? This is not just a laptop on a desk somewhere. There's a whole series of communications links, generators, server stacks, laptops, radios, SATCOM links that go between ships and cars and people and tents, and there's all sorts of complexity in there. It's a hard thing to understand, but this is the whole system that allows the US Army and the other parts of the US Armed Forces to understand the world around it. So, just building on the previous slide, one of the reasons this form of warfare, the form of warfare we're talking about, is regarded as apex formed, because apex form is because of these very deeply embedded kind of process, institutional preferences that I'm kind of alluding to. Defence and military actors rely on a specific set of, they fall back on a specific set of epistemological beliefs, because military actors tend to think of themselves as engineers, or at least sort of like engineers, proxy to engineers, problem solvers. And that means that people, military, defence, myself included, historically, believed in positivism, determinism, and also building on that, the belief in management, managing things effectively. Okay, so there's a series of intersecting beliefs here which shape how we think about the battlefield. Positivism means that we tend to preface information that we can measure, we can see, we can kind of detect. Determinism, we're always going to fall out onto technological solutions for problems. Everyone thinks of themselves as an engineer, and that's really important because it shapes the way we understand our enemies and how we collect information. And the private sector, they also draw on these sets of beliefs. So the industry that produces computers, the IBMs of the world, they also draw on the similar sets of beliefs. So there's an intersection there between computation and the way in which we use computer and information technology and military. I mean, historically, the IT sector was founded on defence funding, right? So it's not exactly much of a surprise. But there's a shared set of values there around how you understand the world around you. And it's founded in those things. And from that, in the private sector, is created management consultancy. This idea that you can kind of reduce any management task down to sort of a one-size-fits-all process or series of kind of tools is, not only did that emerge into the private sector, but it was taken on by the military and defence sector because shared sets of values. So you have this world in which people think about epistemologically the world positively. Epistemologically, the defence world tends to think of itself through a positivist lens, but it also thinks of itself very much through a management consultant lens. So it thinks about management of battle now rather than fighting wars. And I think that's one of the points that Nordin and Oberg make very well, is that they're very focused on management. Violence, well, that's incidental to the kind of conduct of, the delivery of process. And this is, just to sort of drill that point home, there's a fantastic theme of academia about managerialism and its ideology, and how I can relate that to the way in which we think about defence and military and governance is just because a subset of this kind of managerial ideology is enshrined in certainly in British policy, called new policy management. Everything has to be quantified, everything has to be performance managed. We have to think about the world in terms of making it more efficient and optimised, right? So it's enshrined in government practice often. And that, again, is drawn from management consultancy, which uses computers to make things more efficient. So there's this real, overlap, intersection between defence, government, and private sector, and computers. Okay, so you can see how these things start to interrelate. Warfare should be efficient because government should be efficient. And it's also worth pointing out that Klikauer, amongst others, they kind of observe that managerialism is this one-size-fits-all ideology, which emphasises rationality, the objectivity of managers, and the objectivity of supporting technology to justify this way of thinking about the world and managing things. Okay. So, now I've bored you all to tears with some exposition. We can talk a bit about what the importance of that actually is. And here we talk about knowledge production. Hey, this is the intelligence cycle. Now, if you remember, back here, where was it? That's the OODA loop, right? See how complicated it is? All sorts of stuff going on in there. There's people thinking, there's all sorts of references to different sense-making things. And then we have that, which comes out, I think that's British. I think that's from British doctrine. Okay, so I think that's the intelligence cycle. And that is the OODA loop, but very, very substantially kind of reduced to make it simpler and easier to understand. But the way in which we produce within military, the way we think about knowledge production is a search for fact. It's based on cycles like that. It's an iterative practice. We do it often. We keep doing it. We keep grinding away. The more we do it, the more we do it on repeat. So it's happening all the time, trying to find the enemy, trying to understand the battlefield in front of us, trying to understand the world around us. Always supported by technology. and it produces a very certain, very particular form of knowledge, a very particular form of understanding. And it's worth noting that these sorts of cycles are cybernetic. So again, another engineering reference there. That cybernetics, these kind of processes were developed originally during World War II to help predict the path of aircraft gun, the path of aircraft and gun control systems, right? So there's always this kind of engineering relationship between the way we think about the world and process information and the way that we sort of choose to fight our wars. But these processes, the way in which we do this, so these cybernetic processes, they shape institutional preferences, right? So these shape the way in which we think about warfare. But in turn, they also shape us. They also shape the institution. So we created these processes, we created the ideas, we kind of took them on board, and now they shape us. They help to control us. They help to configure the organisation and make sure it stays in line, right? So the more we do this, the more repetitive the more we repeat doing this, and the more this is instilled within doctrine, and the more this is trained, the more it configures us, and the more it keeps us in line. So these processes also act as a control measure to make sure that other ideas don't necessarily take root. Look, we do this already. We don't need to think about anything else. So these shape the epistemological basis of warfare. And what I'll talk about next is using, and I apologise in advance, it's an incredibly crude diagram, but just thinking about what that actually means, okay? So the way in which we understand the world through these different processes, the iterative processes, basically comes down to a filtering effect, right? We go from all the potential information about the battlefield, and then we end up at the other end at targets. And the way we end up at targets is by filtering all of the knowledge through different layers of technology, okay? So whether that's a collection platform like a radar, like an airborne radar or something that's collecting data, whether that's an analytical platform, whether that's a series of some sort of processing tool which uses algorithms to kind of pull certain data from data sets, they all act as filters, but they also all act to enact our epistemological preferences. And I'll give you a particular example that I'm very familiar with. If you've got an analyst sat with a laptop on their desk and they've got an analytical platform open in front of them, such as Palantir Gotham, which some of you may be familiar with, it basically gives you a visualization in 3 dimensions. You will get a network diagram. You will get a timeline, and you will get a geospatial view locating things on the battlefield. That is what you get. Okay, so the sum total of knowledge filtered down to 3 views of the battlefield. That's why epistemology is important, and that's why all the socio-cultural stuff I've just talking about, the historic preferences for fighting warfare, that's why all of this is important, because all of that is manifested into one way of looking at the battlefield, which is inframed by a tool that looks like that. So there it is. Let's just nick that off the internet. That's your user interface. So again, if you think about the sum total of knowledge that's possible about the battlefield, that's what your analyst is using on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so that's reification. That's what's important here. And it's our military epistemological beliefs that have led us here. And it's important also to note that the technology isn't neutral. I kind of touched on this, but one of the best books that I've read is a thing called The Machine at Work by Keith Grint and Steve Woolgar. And they talk about how technology configures its users. Well, in fact, they talk about the way in which we produce computers as being a struggle to configure the user. So the reason I put up a crude diagram and then put the previous slide up was just to kind of step you through this idea that actually what you end up with is the analyst is being configured around certain practices and certain forms of knowledge in order to understand what the enemy's doing. I mean, just to expand on that slightly, you can think about that on day-to-day terms by, the computer that you're holding in front of you has got all sorts of stickers on it saying you void your warranty if you unpeel them, or the junction box out there which says high voltage on it, you're not going to touch it. Technology configures the way in which you do day-to-day tasks. The UI, the user interface on your Windows laptop, that tells you to do things in certain ways. It's really important to remember that as you're doing your daily jobs, you are being configured by the software that you're trying to use. And the same goes in military circles. So you've got all of this stuff happening, right? You've got the data that's being excluded from your analysis. You've got the user interface that's been put in front of you that's excluding other forms of knowledge and other forms of production of knowledge from your daily work. and you're making decisions on that, which affect the way in which you think about warfare. Something to think about. So where are we ended up here? So the reification of the battlefield using data fits this kind of positivist epistemology and allows war to be metrified, and that fits that kind of managerial lens, right? It enables us to kind of, well, where are we? Well, we destroyed 25 targets today and we've got 25 more to go. You can really metrify where we are with warfare, right? So it fits this kind of lens of management, doing things through process, delivering things efficiently and, optimizing our kind of operations around kind of known things, right? Software, technology, knowledge production tools, they really help metrify warfare in a way that any company, any management consultancy company would really understand. So that digital representation that I was talking about, the digital representation that we produce from data on the reified battlefield is something which was attempted in the Vietnam War, let's not forget, is designed in the pursuit of efficiency. Okay, it's not necessarily the same as defeating the enemy. It's designed to produce an efficient means to find and destroy the enemy. Destroy is not the same as defeat. So the question is the model of warfare that I'm talking about, highly datafied, targeted, is that good enough for effective warfare? Well, probably not. I don't think it's probably good enough, I think arguably. I'm going to give an example from my thesis, yay. The reason I put that big horrible thing about DCGS on the previous slide was it was actually one of the key points of my thesis, right? These platforms are highly classified. There's not a lot of information out there on the internet, but there is some stuff. And the stuff that's available gives you a real sense of what a platform like DCGS does. And it's horrendously complicated. You saw the diagram, it's horrible. But there's all sorts of other things in there. There's like a range of data sources available, everything from the weather, open source information, news reporting, classified intelligence, surveillance feeds. There's all sorts of stuff in there. The analyst has access to all of it, all at the same time, all at one time, right? So theoretically, there's all sorts of knowledge production you could do with that. But actually, during the late global war on terror, the analysts hated DCGS. Absolutely, it's in the press. You can read it if you go into Lexis and you have a look through the kind of reporting from the time. There's all sorts of reports of like, well, we hate this thing. It's terrible. It's too complicated. It's hard to use. We can't train on it. It's a bit rubbish. It's hard to retain currency. It's expensive. But this is Palantir guys over here. They're offering us their tool for free, and it's brilliant. Not only is it really cool, and the user interface is awesome, but it's much simpler. It gives us that. And that's much easier to deal with, right? Because it cuts down the amount of stuff that you've got to do. So what you end up with is going from, you had this argument, this pitched battle in the middle of the global war on terror, which was sort of ultimately won by Palantir. But DCGS still exists, it's just Palantir's on it. But you had this kind of moment where they went from all of this possible knowledge, theoretically, and obviously this is the conclusion of my thesis, they went from this platform that offered all of this information to a tool which offers this much information. So you can kind of argue why that might be, but I think what's interesting is that the late global war on terror was also this moment where we explicitly rejected the kind of counterinsurgency narrative that kind of surrounded the wars in Afghanistan particularly. Okay, so if you go back to the kind of 2006, those wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have been described as counterinsurgency. And there's been great store set by the need to understand culture, politics, win the people, all the problematic literatures from Trinquier, Galula, all of that stuff was all rolled out and enshrined in Field Manual 3-24 Counterinsurgency Field Guide, right? So there was a big moment where the US Army and NATO pivoted towards like this complex understanding of the enemy as a cultural phenomenon and trying to kind of build a relationship with the population and win hearts and minds. But then you get to this point where people are arguing over whether you should have DCGS or Palantir Gotham. Well, that stuff's kind of gone out the window because what we've got here is an enemy-centric targeting tool. You've gone from a big complex system where you can understand knowledge in multiple different ways to, well, we just need to know a network, where they are, and when they are, right? So you've gone from complex to very simple. Now, I think that's a correction. So the history of the way in which we think about fighting wars, has been, since the Second World War, efficiency, optimization, process. Counterinsurgency is not process-driven. It's horrible, it's messy, it's bloody, it's brutal, it involves lots of boots on the ground, all the things that we hate doing. We try to do it. The Koinonistas, bless them, Petraeus, not done very well for himself. McChrystal, not done very well for himself. Kilcullen, but their doctrines failed. But the US Army's preferences reasserted themselves, and that's what I think this moment is. So that reification, this, is, I think, a correction where they went from late global war on terror, counterinsurgency, to, well, let's just go and target stuff, because that's much easier and we prefer doing it that anyway. So why am I banging on about this? Well, process war attempts to reduce complexity, it makes war easier, and it makes war more efficient, but is that the same as efficacy? And just to sort of go on slightly further and say that, of course, epistemology is important, but it's important to kind of then think about what we're excluding from our analysis when we're going through that reified view of the enemy that I just kind of tried to set out. Hopefully I set it out in some ways. Because how do you represent those questions as knowledge in the software that I just talked about? You know, how do you represent the will to fight? How do you quantify that? How do you represent what the enemy cares about? How do you quantify that? So the third one is a bit more of a military question for those who understand what an effect is. The majority of the stuff that you'll get from those kind of platforms will be targets, which are very kinetically oriented, meaning they're good for like strikes and operations. There's other forms of effect out there, military effect, which are things like information operations, for example. I haven't seen that particularly represented in any of the software either. So, and the wider question really is, where does strategy fit into any of that? Like, where do these softwares help us understand strategy? So, and these are all questions, they're certainly pre-Clausewitz kind of old, but I think it's significant because I'd argue that technology keeps our heads down, right? So the effect of this stuff is to keep us heads down in tactics. The software is telling us where stuff is on a map. Great, awesome, but that's a tactical question, it's not a strategic question. And the aggregation of tactics is not the same as strategy either. So a strategy of tactics is not the same as actually knowing what we're doing with violence. And I would say that an engineering mindset encourages this search for efficiency, and certainly our tech providers, the Palantirs of the world, they certainly agree with the premise and sort of develop, they're certainly more interested in tactics because that's where you can really quantify the world, right? So they're going to develop tools around their strengths, and those strengths are obviously usually the tactical battle. So our vision of warfare is founded on efficiency and to go faster, but the question is that compatible with strategy? And are we just being drawn down into tactics? And, another point that's worth raising is that if we've got all of this information, if the state, the British government, any government, produces this much information, and our tools and software stuff only allows us to process this much of the information, is that the same as being efficacious? Or is that, that's definitely not efficient, right? Because we're producing this much, but we're only using this much. And, you could argue that's because a lot of it's not machine readable, and maybe we can make it machine readable, but certainly at this point in time, we produce this much, we're using this much. So there's a question there about, again, efficacy versus efficiency. Is it efficient? So now I can start to talk about AI. You're probably relieved. That's a lot. So I'm sorry that there was so much meat there. So again, I just kind of talked about this a little bit, but it's worth kind of noting that the processes and technologies and stuff that I've been talking about is arguably the most important part of current warfare doctrines, right? Where everything's about tactics, right? We think about battle. But do we really think about battle, or do we actually think about process? Because I think you could argue that the tech companies of the world, your Andurils and the other companies out there, they're really interested in tactics, but they're really interested in process. They don't necessarily, you're not going to find an Anduril talking about digging trenches, right? They're not really interested in like engineering support. They're not interested in like, I don't know, food provision. There's all sorts of things they don't do. Of course they don't do that. But what they're really interested in, what they focus on, is process development, technology and support of doing things more efficiently and effectively. And that's mainly around process. They fix and locate us. And the form of warfare that we've adopted, they fix us around process. And that, the expensive investment in technology, including artificial intelligence, is focused on the tactical battle. Very little of it is kind of oriented towards strategy, or very little of it is oriented towards like your general sat in a big cushy chair in a chateau 18 miles behind the line or whatever. It's not really for that. It's really for your sort of tactical commander. And I think that my personal opinion is that investment, which is a lot because AI is expensive and all of this software is expensive, it forces a gulf between the strategic use of war and warfare as we used to know it as an academic domain, and the tactical delivery of warfare. And I use the word delivery very specifically because it's a management word, because I think now we're very focused on delivering war as a process. When I was thinking about the global war on terror, very oriented towards the production of networks and support of kind of counterinsurgency targeting, whatever, kill capture. That war became one that was exclusively a strategy of tactics, right? So we focused on networks, we went after networks. That's a tactical question, that's not a strategic question. Whereas counterinsurgency, theoretically, and I fully accept, you can all pull me aside later and tell me all the ways in which counterinsurgency is bad. I know it is. But theoretically, that's a strategy. That is a thing for an entire problem. It's not just the networks, it's an entire socio-cultural problem it's designed to kind of counter, right? It's a big question. Whereas, networks are tactical, it's very micro level stuff. So we're kind of drawn into the tactics. And finally, where does AI fit? Hooray! Well, AI, like the technologies before it, sold on the basis of efficiency, right? They are like labor-saving devices theoretically, and they optimize processes. They make thing good, make number go up, and they maximize resource efficiency, availability. So they maximize their ability to kind of deploy our resources. And I think what AI is going to do is exacerbate the existing preferences that we already hold. The reason I was banging on for so long about the long tail of how we got here was because this idea, the model of warfare has been going on since World War II, and we haven't got an alternative. We've never been able to steer ourselves toward anything else, even in the face of evidence to show that it hasn't worked, right? So here we are, and AI really is just the latest manifestation of the same model of warfare. It's the same, using the same data sets. Doesn't use all the data sets unless you really will spend ages trying to kind of quantify a qualitative report, which no one wants to do. They do the same thing. So the practices become enshrined within black boxes. Okay, so I would say there's a list of things there. These are the reasons, all the reasons where what I think AI is going to do. It's going to make, it's a black box. It makes explainability difficult. It could, we don't know because I'm theorizing here, but it could take the existing practices, but just make them more opaque. So we put them over there in that server stack over there. No idea what it does. It's great. It's over there. Awesome. It could make decisions invisible.
Can I ask you a question now?
Maybe just let's finish. I think you're wrapping up.
I'm getting there.
Yeah.
I'm getting there.
Just one moment, okay?
Sorry. I will speed up. And I think importantly, and this is something we're already in a position of, I've tried to kind of hammer home this point, it could further foreclose discussion about other forms of knowledge, analysis, and other forms of warfare. The more stuff is black box, the less easy it is to undo the black box afterwards and talk about what the alternatives might be. Okay, so it's also worth pointing out that AI is substantively more expensive than existing tool sets, right? I mean, by order of magnitude more expensive. And it raises this ugly question of like human-machine trade-offs. So how many analysts are we going to have against the engineers that we need to support the stack that supports the AI, right? So how much more is that going to exacerbate the problems we already have with reification? I think the investment will further exacerbate this kind of gulf in importance, relative importance between the tactical battle of datafied warfare and the traditional study of strategy and the traditional practice of strategy. We can argue about who listens to that and whether it's actually important or not, I'm sure. But just trying to raise the point that the old school world of war and strategy is kind of being rendered slightly obsolete by this kind of focus on the strategy of tactics, which will be exacerbated by artificial intelligence and its family of technologies. I don't know what I'm pointing at over here. So, again, AR, this is the nearly penultimate slide. Just thinking about how that's going to kind of play out, because one of the points I wanted to make is that the majority of the AI that we're going to get within defence is going to be outsourced. And I think that's recognised because the level of investment needed to train the models and to bring them into service can only be serviced by the private sector. And there are companies that are already doing that. But there's consequences to outsourcing everything, right? I mean, we would have talked about more black boxes, but we'll have less control over those black boxes. So it exacerbates those problems of configuration that I was already talking about. I don't know if we've really fully tried to understand whether the vision of warfare that's held by the private sector as they're instituting these AI tools is the same as the one that we want to have within the state. So that I think is something that needs exploring, and we are subject to configuration by the tech industry, who are very influential, and they share a lot of values with us because the tech sector has grown up symbiotically with the state and defence, but they have their own ideas, and I think there is a power deficit there that needs to be explored. And again, just more focus on tactical stuff. We're going to get drawn back even further into the weeds of the tactical battle. And I'm going to conclude and then make a last point that warfare is more of a tactical exercise of management. Strategy is withering in the face of technology and investment, particularly in AI. And what I think strategy should be doing is acting as a check and balance on the practice of warfare. Why are we doing it? Is this worth doing? Should we stop now? All of those questions should be the domain of strategy, and I think we're kind of excluding that because we're laser focused on delivering a tactical thing through technology. So at the same time, the focus on process, which is the heart of the implementation of technology, lifts our gaze away from fighting, right? So we ignore the kind of the brutal reality of the Ukrainian battlefield, and we think about the clever stuff about drones and targeting. Okay, but the reality of war hasn't changed. But what technology does is draw us away from strategy and away from battle itself and into process, which is the point of... Go away and read Nordin and Oberg's paper, it's really good. I think arguably violence is creeping out of control of the state because we're ceding control over decisions whilst failing to respect the role strategy plays in locating the purpose of war against wider goals. Now, we can argue about whether that's ever been done effectively, probably not, but nonetheless, that's the theory. I think it's becoming exacerbated by the black boxing of automation. And last point, I think this tweet, which someone tweeted at me, and it floored me because it's worth noting that the premise of my research and my interest is founded on the idea that we collectively want to fight war more effectively, more quickly, achieve objectives in the most effective way possible so we can stop fighting. Someone pointed out to me that my observations about targeting itself might actually be a moot point, depending on how we think about military power, right? So it hit home to me the point that the divorcing of tactical effect from the state itself, and it's going to be exacerbated by artificial intelligence, is really could it be a symptom of the changing role of war? I mean, we should be asking, where does the historic interdisciplinary academic discourse around strategy fit into a model of warfare that's valorizing tactical engagement without really engaging with fighting? Okay, so I would say the discourse around AI, decision support technology, is focused on process at the expense of everything, whether it's the brutality of violence or the important question of what war plays in international politics. Instead, the language of decision support, artificial intelligence, reflects the language of managerialism and engineering and process, over which there should be a question mark when it comes to kind of what war is for and what it's fought for. And I think